Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, episode 42A, an interview on Bill Clinton's economic legacy with Nelson Lichtenstein. I'm excited to welcome Nelson Lichtenstein to the show today. Nelson is a research professor in history at UC Santa Barbara, and he is the author of last year's book, A Fabulous Failure, The Clinton Presidency and the Transformation of American Capitalism. Despite all the drama of the Clinton years, Clinton left office with a 66% approval rating, in large part because 81% of Americans approved his handling of the economy. In fact, 71% said 1999 was the best economy of their lifetimes, all according to Gallup. So folks were pretty happy at the time, but what all did Clinton do? How much credit does he actually deserve? And how does that legacy hold up in hindsight? That's what we're going to dig into today. Thank you for your time, Nelson.
Glad to be here.
So we know the 1992 presidential election was, to paraphrase, all about the economy, stupid. So what was Clinton's economic platform that year as he ran for office?
Well, right. When he did run, it was a mix. There were mixed elements of it, but one thing that was definitely in the and reflected by it's the economy phrase that Carville put on the wall of the war room in Little Rock meant that they understood that there'd been a kind of recession, that the Bush and Reagan years had created more inequality, and so he was quite aware of that. And Clinton came to that campaign in '92 with an idea of kind of what today we'd call it industrial policy. That was what President Biden put forward. And Clinton had a kind of modest industrial policy idea. He wanted to take a more kind of vigorous, want to sort of managing American capitalism. Actually, the most important part of that industrial policy was health insurance, the health insurance reform, which, I mean, they were quite clear that this was 1/7 of the American economy, and in putting that forward, there were other things as well, but let me just mention that in putting that forward, they made a point, made it that this was in the interests of American business to have a thoroughgoing reform of the health insurance system, and they had a meeting at Little Rock called an Economic Summit in December of 1992, and they had liberal Keynesians who were giving speeches, but also they had lots of executives there. But the reason these executives there from Ford and other places was to say, yes, the American industry is having a problem competing with the Japanese, laying off people, et cetera. And some of the plans that the Clinton administration would put forward, especially health insurance, and will be helpful. I mean, the head of Ford, made the point. It was true then, true now, actually, that the auto companies were spending more money on health insurance than on steel.
Wow.
And that in Canada, for example, where the auto industry actually was booming, they had national health insurance, and
right.
not as much of a problem. So there was that element of it. There was also elements of they wanted to a certain kind of stimulus plan. For example, they wanted to tax carbon, high use of carbon. Robert Reich, who would become the Secretary of Labor, had some ideas about industrial training and apprenticeships. There were a number of programs that they had that were not sort of neoliberal or not what Clinton actually ended up. The way he I'll get to this free trade element in a second.
Yeah.
The way he ended up differently than when he began. And one of the points of the book that I'm making is that Clinton didn't walk into the White House as a neoliberal or a simply an unproblematic free trader, et cetera. That he was defeated, a fabulous failure. That he was defeated. The word failure has many meanings, but one of them was he was defeated within his administration, and then also in terms of party politics a couple of years later, when the Republicans took control of Congress. But his initial it's the economy, stupid. That idea meant, yes, the government has to sort of take a more vigorous hand in managing American capitalism. We can't just let the free market do it. That's not going to work. Now, the nature of the defeat and he suffers a defeat on multiple levels. It's both, again, within the administration, people like Robert Rubin, who was his chief economic advisor, later Secretary of the Treasury, but also the National Economic Council, he's a Wall Street liberal. I mean, the thing that he comes out of Goldman Sachs, he really is the second most important person in the entire Clinton administration for many years. I mean, there's no doubt about it. He's a liberal. His mother was an activist for Henry Wallace in 1948. He raised money for George McGovern. I mean, Robert Rubin is not a black-hatted capitalist. He's a social liberal. But his sine qua non, the essence of his politics is, yes, we want a welfare state. Sure, we want racial equality. He was very active in various, things involving African Americans in New York City, etc. But the sine qua non for him is the mobility of capital cannot be obstructed. That was the key thing. That was the key thing. And we must have that. And one can see that throughout his entire career. He began as an arbitrageur. That meant, and arbitrageurs are when you're mergers, what's the price of the stock, and that requires liquidity. Right. That's the essence. And I mean, he became a millionaire, multimillionaire as a result of that. But it really became the essence of the way he thought, and he thought that was a good thing. He thought that we would have free trade is his own justification. So Rubin is kind of the center. There are other people with him, but he really, and he's a very charismatic figure, very. Bill Clinton, when he called Robert Rubin the most important Secretary of the Treasury since Alexander Hamilton, maybe, but it wasn't. Well, he was very influential. Anyway, in a sense, one defeat for Clinton is that Robert Rubin really comes to run American economic policy. In cooperation with Alan Greenspan at the Federal Reserve and Larry Summers, who is Rubin's key aide in the Treasury Department. So they really win. And again, it's winning within the administration. There are debates that are taking place. There's a kind of left wing in the administration, including Laura Tyson, who is a kind of unorthodox economist out of Berkeley, and Robert Reich and right. Our Magaziner. There's a debate that's going on, and I mean, it's complicated. It takes place over a year or two, but basically the Rubin people win. And it's what when you're talking about a presidential administration, what's very clear, I think, maybe it'll even be true. Certainly was true in the Biden era. Maybe even, who knows, with Trump. This is a kind of a weird thing, but the president is not actually free to do everything he wants. So one of the things Clinton had liberal instincts, and he would find an article in the newspaper or a magazine, and it would say, well, yeah, why can't we do this? Like an investment bank or some sort of regulatory aspect. And he'd write, on the edge of it, I saw these, and why can't we do this? Something that, say, George Soros had actually suggested, who was kind of in those days. And he'd send it over to Treasury. And then, 5 days later would come back a 6-page single-spaced, memo. No, here's the reason you can't do it. I mean, that was clear when you had that kind of institutional authority, and the Treasury was unquestionably the most important cabinet office in the Clinton administration. Clinton is like, duh, okay. I mean, anyway. It's describing the internal politics. Now, of course, this is also, there's a kind of, the predicate is, there is, in fact, this is the period, the 90s, the Cold War is over, the version of non-capitalist, world that's represented by the Soviet Union, a kind of perverse, anti-capitalism, but nevertheless, that's gone. This is the intellectually, kind of ideologically, the moment of when neoliberalism is at its height in terms of what economists are saying, what commentators are saying, what etc. So so the winds were blowing with Rubin and all. But I mean, you would have this kind of argument, for example, in terms of free trade. You would, the argument would be, oh, okay, opening up China to free trade, to capitalism, and that's also true, say, of Mexico and other
Sure.
countries.
Sure.
Well, capitalism equals, civil society.
Right.
It
Right.
will, in and of itself, generate a kind of uh, liberal, sort of, kind of, institutionally correct, kind of openness. I mean, one of the arguments of Charlene Barshevsky, who was the key trade figure in the Clinton administration, was when speaking about China. Look, if you're going to have capitalism in China, and you're
Mm-hmm.
going to trade stocks, Chinese state-owned enterprises are now going to be traded on the New York Stock Exchange, and they were. Well, then you have to have accurate information about the stock, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then that has to be reprinted in the newspapers or on the web, and then you have to have accurate commentary about it, right? I mean,
Mm.
it's the argument, oh, you're going to get civil society, you're going to get, basically, freedom,
Yeah.
and I mean, the Clinton people really ran with that in
Mm.
I mean, just embarrassing now,
Yeah. Yeah.
cell phones plus the computer, equals, democracy. I mean, it was really quite. Anyway, I could go on about that, and I will, so anyway, so the point that I want to make, the main point is,
Yeah.
Clinton begins. He's a liberal. He does have ideas. Arkansas. He spent more time in the state house in Arkansas than in the White House. And what's the problem of Arkansas? Economic development.
Right.
How is the governor and the state going to do that? Clinton went over to Italy, went to Germany, went to Japan. What models can I bring back? He was trying. That was his
Mm.
main thing. And Clinton, one newspaper reporter said Clinton's campaign speeches in Arkansas sounded like a seminar in economic development, with the use of the state. So that's what he comes to the White House with, and but I think that impulse, again, as I'm saying, is defeated. That is the point, and maybe it was inevitable, but it is defeated. That's the failure aspect of it. Okay. Now, I mean, he blundered into lots of things and helped make that failure inevitable. I mean, we'll talk about NAFTA, I'm sure.
Yeah. We will definitely talk about free trade. We'll talk more about healthcare for sure.
Yeah, healthcare too. But that I think is the dynamic here, and I guess that's important for today.
Yeah.
If the liberals ever return to power, that it's not enough to just have good ideas. What's the constellation of forces that you're going to work with that's going to make those ideas both powerful, effective, and majoritarian.
So Clinton came into the office with dreams of launching some large, innovative stimulus programs. He had some advisors who were like, "Yeah, let's do that." The Keynesians, he had some advisors who were like, "No, let's not do that. Let's do something else." And one of my favorite quotes, actually, of Clinton that I believe emerged from one of the in-office debates from this time was him saying, "You mean to tell me that the success of the program and my reelection hinges on the Federal Reserve and a bunch of fucking bond traders?" Can you unpack that and the arguments that were happening and how they went the way they went?
Right. Well, the argument then, which is then, that was 30 odd years ago. It's not true today. But and then, and this is part of that sort of intellectual, ideological world of that moment, was that if we have budget deficits, this will have the effect of crowding out the private investment, therefore raising the interest rates, and that will then have a deleterious effect on investment, which is what we want. And Robert Rubin and Greenspan made this argument in particular, and again, so therefore we can't spend money on stimulus or on various programs we want, or our health care plan has to be shaped in such a way that it doesn't cost much money, because we must get that deficit down, because only then will the interest rates be lower, and then you have investment. I mean, so Rubin would say, Robert Reich, you want $50 billion of stimulus, fine, but that's peanuts. If we get interest rates really down, then we'll get $1 trillion worth of. That was what he said. That was what he said. Now, so again, that's a debate that's very sharply posed. That that was a very sharp debate, and again, the Greenspan. In fact, there was a kind of a moment when Greenspan is supposed to stay out of this. He's at the Federal Reserve. He's but he has some meetings, and it's clear that he's having some influence and basically telling the Clinton people, if you keep the budget deficit low and going downhill, and that means get rid of all these stimulus plans, then I will promise you lower interest rates later on.
Okay, so the independent Federal Reserve is actually not so independent.
So that's what happened. So Clinton's statement, I feel like I'm Eisenhower, and we're, and the bond traders are the ones who are running the show. This is where it came from. That why do we have to get interest rates? Why do we have to get the deficit down? Because bond traders in London or Tokyo or Hamburg or wherever they, or in New York, they're the ones who are running this. They will then respond. So it's sort of out of our control, and they are the ones. It was actually Carville who said, when I was a kid, I wanted to be either the Pope or a 400 baseball hitter. But now, if I'm reincarnated, I want to come back as the international bond market. They can anybody. That's what James Carville said. So he was one of the liberals in this fight. So that's what happened. Now, let me just. It was interesting that Alan Greenspan, he came to actually bond interest rates did go down for about a year. Then they went back up again. It turns out that there wasn't a relationship between budget deficits and bond interest rates. I mean, today we have gigantic deficits, and we had low interest rates for a long, long time.
Right.
Now they're up. Now they're coming down again. But anyway, but Greenspan, toward the end of the second term, Clinton term, came to the conclusion, and we should talk about this a little bit, that technological changes were so rapid, and we were getting a new economy. That was the phrase, new economy, which meant, a kind of web-based, technologically, Silicon Valley-oriented economy. That was having such an impact on productivity,
right,
that we could afford both higher wages, in a certain amount of inflation, not a lot. And that we could then interest rates could also come down because we were in a new productive economy. And so Greenspan jumped on that, and many other Clinton people did as well. And so in the second half of the 1990s, and this is one reason for the boom that Clinton did enjoy, was that interest rates did come down. There was investment. There was also speculation. There's something called, asset-based sort of Keynesianism, meaning everyone felt flush because the stock market was going up, and therefore let's go out and buy another car or buy.
Sure. Yeah.
So and then in addition, I mean, so that's and unemployment did decline in the second term, Clinton's second term. It did decline pretty substantially. I mean, today though we also have low unemployment, but it did as well, and so Clinton was very proud of that. Yeah.
All right, so these are some of the forces swirling around Clinton. The arguments for doing this, for doing that, from opposite sides of the spectrum. One of the first things that kind of lands on his plate here is free trade agreements, which you teased earlier. The United States had free trade agreements with Canada and I believe Israel when Clinton entered office, but he had a decision to make about Mexico because Bush Sr. had negotiated North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which would create a free trade zone between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. What was the debate around NAFTA, and why did Clinton not just sign it, but he actively pushed it through a reluctant Congress?
Right. Yeah, it was sort of it was between a blunder and a crime, is what it was, and I mean, there's a difference in a blunder and a crime, but anyway, the two go together. One thing was Mexico and the elite in Mexico. By the way, Carlos Salinas, who was the prime minister, they were PhD economists trained at Chicago and places like that. So it wasn't like the Mexicans were not out of this conversation. They were part of the anyway. So they had abandoned sort of kind of controls on capital, and they needed to export, use their cheap labor to export. And so the Mexican government, the Mexican elite anyway, was very much in favor of a so-called free trade agreement with Canada and the United States. President Bush had negotiated this agreement based on very much on just simply open free trade agreements.
Mhm.
There was trade. Trade had been going on, rising. There was a Honduras system, and where there were plants along the border. There was a lot of that going on. When Clinton in his campaign, he was aware. He was talking to labor. He had liberal and labor people around him, and they said, "Look, if you're going to have you must have guardrails that will sort of make it possible for that Mexicans are not just using cheap labor. That you have to have free and independent trade unions. That we have to have a kind of certain kinds of we don't Mexicans don't just dump cheap stuff in the U.S. or they don't just take factories. That there were various proposals for making it a somewhat stronger and better plan. And Clinton made that clear in the campaign and in later on. What happened was that that he had a terribly difficult first 6 or 7 months of his administration. All sorts, all sorts of things were happening. The issue of gays in the military,
Right.
his budget, which finally did pass, which did raise taxes, by the way, on the rich, but it also didn't have much stimulus in it. It passed with like one vote. It was very close on a party line vote. The healthcare initiative was getting off to a rocky start, and so Clinton was desperate for something bipartisan, and that's where the blunder, the crime comes. And so he thought, NAFTA will be, and there was a debate inside the administration. No, this is Bush's thing. Let's push this off for another year or two. Let's do healthcare first. That's much more important. Let's use our political capital for that. But Clinton said, we need to get this bipartisan thing through. And then, there were some people who were telling him, well, it will produce jobs on both sides of the border. So right. They do. So they use political capital that they have. And yeah, he does get one of the things about trade, all the trade agreements in the Clinton era, there were many of them with China, and then there was all sorts of China trade agreements. Clinton increasingly relies on Republican votes to get these things through. I think in NAFTA he gets about 50% of the Democrats for it, but by the end of his administration he's getting about 30% of the Democrats and the Republicans. So he's not a very good party manager. He's not a very good leader of the Democratic Party, but he gets it through. It was kind of ugly, and it passes. Now here was the thing about NAFTA. And of course, Ross Perot famously, in the debate with Al Gore, said, there'll be a giant sucking sound. Now
right. Of jobs going south of the border.
NAFTA, was many things happened. It did have American companies did put factories in Mexico. Even more important is that American corn and wheat could go float into Mexico.
Sure.
And that put 5 million Mexican peasants, threw them off their farms. Wow. And where did they go? They went to either the cities or the border. In other words, that was something that the Mexican government didn't care about. Anyway, but Mexico would become politically toxic, and I'll get to that in a second. It became politically toxic. It really was very important in the 1994 elections, which Clinton lost decisively.
Midterms, yeah.
Economically, however, NAFTA was not as important as the opening to China. It was just not. And China was a much bigger. The entire Mexican economy is about the size of Southern California. Okay, China is gigantic and was becoming bigger. Right. It was the third biggest economy in the world and would become the second biggest very quickly. China, and it would be in the latter, the second Clinton administration, where the China is admitted to the World Trade Organization, and there's a certain kind of trade agreements are reached with China. When we talk about closing factories in the north, which happened in not just during Clinton's period, but during the Bush period, the W. Bush. Sure. It was really China. China was more important than NAFTA. But NAFTA was politically toxic because, well, immigration is linked to it, right? And also it's right there on our border. And so some political scientists and economists have done studies and shown that in the 1994 elections, NAFTA was a decisive event which turned many voters against Clinton, and he loses dramatically. Newt Gingrich, Newt Gingrich was a free trader, but it didn't matter. Clinton was discredited.
Yeah, so when you're talking about blunder, he does it for political reasons. The political reasons backfire, and the long-term impact was negative.
Right. Yeah. And so today, when we hear when someone wants to denounce Clinton, they mention NAFTA. But that was an issue, but China is just much more important.
NAFTA it's a fun word to say. Who doesn't want to say NAFTA? I don't even know what the Chinese trade deal is called. But
it was admitting them to that World Trade Organization.
Okay, got it.
Along with that was certain opening, and I mean I could get to that. One of the main things on China was that, and here was again Rubin and his friends in Wall Street. The U.S. exported nothing to China. I mean, they made the argument. Oh yeah, we're going to export. We exported nothing to China. But what we did do, and here's how the U.S. did make money. At least some people in the U.S. The Wall Street firms helped capitalize the state-owned enterprises in China, which were being privatized and marketized and selling shares in London and New York. And so it was Goldman Sachs and these firms. They were the ones who helped put those together and made a lot of money, when these things were then, could be traded on the New York Stock Exchange. Like we're talking, China Telecom, it's like gigantic.
Right. Who doesn't want to own this railroad or that phone company?
That was the issue there with China. Could American financial firms go into China and be a player there? And that was one of the key things that Rubin and his people wanted, and they got it. They more or less got it. And there was a lot of money made on Wall Street. We sold nothing. I mean, the greatest export we had to China was cardboard boxes, stuffed into containers, sending them back to China.
I've been to Shenzhen, and I've seen pictures of what Shenzhen looked like in 1990, and there was nothing back then. Now it's a major city. So
I've been to Shenzhen too, and I did a book on Walmart in China, in America and also China, and so Walmart, would source, a huge amount of its own stuff and of all the imports, kind of light manufacturing, and more recently cars, but mainly, everything, toys, apparel, electronics, etc.
You mentioned healthcare earlier. And how healthcare reform was one of the big things Clinton campaigned on, one of the big things he wanted, but he ultimately fell short and failed to get anything passed. So what was his plan? Why did he fail? And what impact did that failure have on the rest of his agenda?
Yes. Well, the Clinton put forward the healthcare plan, and Ira Magaziner was in charge of it. And Ira Magaziner had been a business consultant, kind of a lefty, new left business consultant, but nevertheless, he'd worked with the steel industry, and he'd worked with, which was collapsing in the 1970s and 80s, and he could see that, that the healthcare was one of these expenses that needed to be got under control, and Clinton argued for and really oriented his healthcare plan so that it would be beneficial, well, to ordinary Americans who would have a guaranteed health insurance, that would be clear, but also to sort of what the big industries, the kind of legacy industries, that's the phrase, cars, steel, manufacturing, things of that sort, who were taking the cost of healthcare was a terrific burden on them. In contrast, the Walmarts and PepsiCo's and Pizza Huts and all of that great big world of kind of a service sector, a retail, hospitality, which was millions and millions of people being employed in this booming in this period. I mean, they were they were scofflaws. They were shirking their responsibility. They were really often transferring the cost of healthcare to a manufacturing firm. If the husband works for a firm that does have healthcare, and the spouse or the kids work for Walmart, it was basically cost shifting. And
you'd be on your husband's plan or spouse's plan.
So initially, And American business in the 80s was very active in trying to figure out how can we cut healthcare plans. Healthcare. There were two ways to do it. One is you just tell the workers we're not paying for it anymore, and you want to go on strike, go on, and that would happen.
Yeah.
90% of all strikes in the 80s had healthcare as one of their issues. Or we can go to Washington and figure something out. Lee Iacocca in the 1980s became very active in searching for a Washington-oriented governmental healthcare plan. And Douglas Fraser, head of the UAW, had negotiated with Lee Iacocca. He said, "Well, Iacocca sounds like an Italian socialist when you talk about healthcare, And he was, he'd been head of Chrysler. So that was the plan. I mean, I won't go into all the details of the plan. In effect, what the plan would create big purchasing alliances of companies, of large companies, which would then purchase health insurance, and their market power would be such that they could reduce the price of that health insurance. And then the government would come in with certain kinds of, one thing would be a mandate that all employers had to have health insurance for their employees. That would have the effect of creating a large pool including healthy people, and so that would have the effect of driving down the cost. This was the plan, and again, there was a lot of support for it. Initially, Clinton did run on this, in part in 1992. What happened was, and this is why I certainly put the phrase "Transformation of American Capitalism" in the title, is that it turned out that companies like Chrysler or U.S. Steel or the big old manufacturers, which the Clinton people were, they knew about them, and Magaziner had worked with them. They were less important than the Walmarts and the office, the big box retailers and the hotels and the service sector. And so you got inside the Chamber of Commerce, inside the Business Roundtable, inside the American Manufacturers Association, you got fights inside of these organizations between the kind of heavily capitalized, high wage kind of firms that needed health insurance, and then these, the kind of the new economy firms in a way, the Walmarts. And one thing I do in my book, which I thought is not done, is I show the internal fights inside these organizations, which the Clinton administration is very much aware of, and they're trying to to intervene, like in the internal life of the Chamber of Commerce or the Business Roundtable, and that was where the real fight took place. And basically, the heavy manufacturers, the ones who would have benefited from the Clinton plan, they lose out. So these capitalist institutions, associations, come out against the plan. Now, in addition to that, and importantly, is Newt Gingrich and the right-wing Republican Party.
Yep.
And at that time, Bill Kristol, who was very conservative in those days.
Yep. My, has he changed?
Right. They said, the Republican Party has got to fight this plan, tooth and nail, because otherwise, if it succeeds, the Clinton administration will be, project themselves as the guardians and the benefactors of the.
You can't give them any wins that they can run on.
That's right. And it was real. And Bill Kristol makes that absolutely clear. And so you have the odd thing, which you don't have business lobbying Congress. You have conservative Republicans lobbying business.
Oh, wow.
And they go to the Chamber of Commerce and they go to the National Association of Manufacturers and say, no, you've got to be against these plans. Even though save you money, you got to be against them. And someone like Bob Dole, for example, early on said, well, there'll be a plan. We'll compromise. It'll be something a little more Republicans will like, but it'll happen. And Bill Kristol says, no. So that was a kind of ideological, but also economic fight. I think the Clinton plan actually was to the left of what Obama ended up, putting in there. But I would say this, that Obama, 15 years later, he learned a lot of lessons from Clinton, and that was you gotta get these business associations on your side and make sure they're solid. And Obama did that. It was ugly. He gave them money. He gave them cutouts, but he did. But he did. The Pharmaceutical Association of America was totally in favor of the Obama plan because they were going to make a lot of money, and et cetera. I mean, the Harry and Louise, the famous Harry and Louise commercials. Do you think your listeners heard of that? They were, basically they were actually, interestingly, the sponsors of the famous Harry and Louise anti healthcare commercials, which were basically, a couple saying this plan is too complicated and too much government, and then we don't want it. Well, the sponsors of that were not the big insurance companies. Who were initially on the side of the Clinton plan because they would get thousands of millions of new customers, and they would make money. It was the smaller insurance companies whose business model was to cherry pick only the healthy, the healthy, or to do stupid things like only selling insurance that covers cancer, which is ridiculous, And so they could see that they would frankly be put out of business by the Clinton plan, really.
What was the impact of healthcare's failure on the rest of Clinton's agenda?
Well, obviously, it deprived him of something that he could say was accomplished, that they accomplished, and also the way it collapsed was in the sense all these people who had been supporting it sort of peeled off. It added to the general sense that government is incapable of doing anything effectively, and in a big way. The Clinton actually did over in the last part of in the second term, he did incrementally add some elements of the plan were put into effect. The so-called children's health insurance plans, which every state would run, they were called CHIPS. That was put into effect, and that had the effect of helping mothers and children. One more thing I will say. I got this from the sociologist Paul Starr, who was also very actively involved in it. One of the aspects of the early Clinton plan was that Medicaid, not Medicare, Medicaid, which had a welfare aspect to it and was always sort of a poor cousin to Medicare, which is for people over 65, that was really going to be eliminated. We don't need Medicaid if we're going to have every employer and all people are going to have.
Interesting.
But when the failure of it, it turns out that Medicaid was enhanced. It was a little bit more money was given. It began to grow. It became the sort of default health insurance plan for the very bottom of the working class and unemployed. And then when Obama came in, they sort of realized that. And so the most successful part of Obamacare by far is the expansion of Medicaid. And in a state like Kentucky, 2/3 of all the people are on Medicaid, and it's been made better, and it's not as good as it could be, but it's better and bigger. And I think that was one. Again, Obama learned a lot from Clinton, and when he put his plan into effect. I mean, one thing he learned, of course, was let's do health insurance right away. The first thing we want to do right away before the opposition mobilizes. They did mobilize, but he got it through.
They did. I remember the Obama years very well. So 2 years after getting his clock cleaned on healthcare, Clinton faced a decision to make on welfare, which you mentioned in passing a moment ago. He wanted to reform it. Republicans wanted to reform it, but Republicans held Congress, so they presented him a Republican plan. Would you mind, real quick, kind of succinctly, what was the plan? What was the internal debate around it? And why did Clinton ultimately sign it into law?
Yeah, welfare reform ended up sort of like NAFTA as the most toxic thing that Clinton did, certainly in the eyes of liberals, and it was. I mean, it deserved a lot of it. Again, once the Republicans had the initial idea, Clinton did talk about ending welfare as we know it. He used that phrase in the 1992 presidential campaign, it was purposely ambiguous. What did it mean? Ending welfare, or ending welfare as we know it, meaning, it will be transformed. And again, the original idea was we're going to have basically a job guarantee for anybody, who's on welfare once they get off. Then you're guaranteed a job, whether it's the government or someplace else, and then also guaranteed lots of help, of child care and things of that sort. Clinton was influenced by William Julius Wilson, the sort of certainly kind of liberal African American sociologist at Chicago, who had written a very important book about the urban crisis and the kind of the failure of the black family, but black men couldn't get jobs, and the solution was to make sure that the people are employed, that employment was a kind of dignity and worthwhile, and there's an element of that. I mean, that's important. Anyway, but once the Republicans come in, of course, they pick up all the most conservative aspects of the Clinton plan, basically cutting people off, and push that. And Clinton, again, makes one of these sort of what are we going to call it? Blunder opportunism, too clever by half, and basically thinks, that, well, I'm not going to get reelected in '96 unless I go along with some of the aspects of this welfare reform, which would have the effect of basically saying that, and it was targeted toward women, and really black women, and that was in everyone's imagination. Okay, you'll have welfare for 2 years, and then you're thrown off, and unless you get a job.
Right.
There were some illusions that the Clinton people had. Well, if we have raised the minimum wage, we have a booming economy, low unemployment, well, then it won't be so bad, etc. But it was unquestionably it touched a nerve. And the only people who ever resigned in protest from the Clinton administration, they didn't resign over NAFTA, they resigned over welfare reform. Marian Wright Edelman and her husband Peter Edelman, who'd been longtime friends of the Clintons. Hillary had worked for Marilyn Wright Edelman. I mean, they just resigned and denounced Clinton for all of this. Now, the interesting thing about welfare reform is, at the time, 30 years ago, it was really a toxic nerve, unpopular among liberals, and Clinton is denounced, for etc. for that. Okay, today, or really in the last decade or two, and Biden put this into effect for at least for a couple years, is we aren't going to have tests, to see what your income is, or force you into a job. We're just going to give money, for child support, to everyone, basically, who isn't very rich, who has kids. And that was what the initial in the COVID period, some of those child support plans, and they reflected a kind of realization on the part of liberals and even some conservatives that we don't want to try to force people into the labor market, we'll just give them money, and that's where liberals are today. And I mean, that's going to happen now because of the election, but that was what Harris was saying. We're going to restore the support payments to all women, regardless of whether they work or don't work. Doesn't matter. We're just going to do it. Not families, not just women. So that the kind of Clintonite welfare reform of 30 years ago is no longer a kind of flashpoint, because it's been superseded by what the liberal agenda is today.
What would you say the long-term impact of that has been? You mentioned,
Well. I mean, it turned out that there was a booming labor market in the late 1990s, so it didn't have the families on the street impact that say someone like Senator Moynihan thought it would. But it did over time. It did open the door to really a repeal of many of the new things that were the entitlements that were thought that were New Deal. The idea of New Deal entitlements, and the phrase entitlement became a dirty word, a kind of,
Mm-hmm.
nasty. We don't want that. But in fact, the entitlements were kind of, at the part of the basis of the New Deal, and really part of the basis of the fighting the COVID unemployment, 3 or 4 years ago. I mean, I think one of the arguments about the defeat of the Democrats recently is that the people enjoyed a kind of welfare state for about 18 months, in that period. I mean, they were getting checks and they were getting support, and then all of a sudden it disappeared. We have rent control, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, if NAFTA undercut Clinton's support among especially white Southern, working class Democrats, and it did. Welfare reform undercut Clinton's support among kind of liberal Northern, and African American, people.
Interesting. Okay. In 1999, Clinton declared the Glass-Steagall Act, a New Deal era regulation that de-risked the economy by separating commercial banks
Right.
from investment firms. He said it was no longer appropriate, and he signed legislation that weakened it.
Right.
9 years later, this
Yeah.
deregulation contributed to the 2008 financial crisis and the depression that followed. This is Clinton's most famous deregulation, but I'm curious, what's the bigger picture on deregulation when it comes to Clinton? What else? What all is he doing here?
Well, in terms of finance, right? It turns out that the Glass-Steagall, which divided investment banking from sort of more ordinary commercial banking, where you just give loans, you don't actually sell stock. That had been a pillar of the New Deal, really trying to end speculation, et cetera. It turned out that the Federal Reserve, one aspect of the Federal Reserve is that they regulate banks, and beginning really in the late 80s and increasing under Greenspan, they were allowing ordinary banks to be investment banks, and they were weakening that Glass-Steagall stricture. And so by the time the 1999 comes along, basically there was like Travelers Insurance wanted to merge with the Citibank, and there was just kind of the merger mania of that period, and there was pressure on Clinton to sort of sign this law, which would actually make totally legal and what was happening already in a way.
Got it. So they stopped enforcing a law. Why don't you just strike it off the books, man?
Yeah. The bigger financial deregulation was derivatives, and which was happening at the same time. And here again, within the administration, there was a fight. Boxley Bourne, who was head of the Commodity Future Trading Corporation, which is a otherwise obscure agency, but in fact she was in charge of derivatives, because in the 19th century, if you're going to sell a future on hog bellies or corn, that's sort of the same thing as a derivative selling a future on a stock. Anyway, they were complicated financial instruments, really predicated on the idea that they wouldn't fail. And so these derivatives were lucrative to Wall Street, and there was a fight inside the administration. They wanted to regulate it. Boxley Bourne and others wanted to regulate them. But again, in this period of the late 90s, this period, financial innovation's a great thing. It's practically as important as the computer. That we have a new economy. We can't restrain, a trade. Liquidity of capital is essential. That's what Summers and Rubin said. There's a fight, and basically those who wanted to regulate these derivatives, at least some kind of regulation, lose, and you just get this explosion of derivatives, which are really bets, seemingly safe bets, but when things go wrong in 2008, really it's a huge disaster. Interestingly, virtually every Clinton administration figure in 2008, with the exception of Larry Summers, offers a mea culpa, saying we made a mistake. We shouldn't have done that, But I think Glass-Steagall, my sense about Glass-Steagall was this: it became well known, but it was not as important as the deregulation of derivatives in terms of financial crisis.
The derivatives sound very central
That
to
was a
the
big,
financial crisis. The
huge thing.
bet that housing will always go up.
We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of trillions of dollars
Yeah.
of potential kind of potentially that you have to pay off, and when it all does collapse in 2008, I mean the Fed does things that it never would have thought possible to do before. But they just, I mean, very active intervention in the markets. A tremendous amount of money is loaned to Europe, as a matter of fact,
Right.
to keep the European banks going. Anyway, but this late period of the Clinton period, there's this, I think the larger ideological, intellectual idea is that this is the climax of neoliberalism, that it's good for the economy, it's good for democracy, what does Russia need? Russia needs, open markets and
more capitalism.
that capital, will create, it will create a civil society and democracy. And this idea is powerful and it's all over the place and it's wrong, but it's there.
Right. All right. Just a few more questions for you. And the next one is kind of the culmination. We've talked about all these different factors, different laws, different fights in the 90s.
Yep.
At the end of the 90s,
yeah.
people are looking back at a period of tremendous growth. The GDP grew 4% a year. More than 22 million new jobs are created.
Yep.
Median family income rose 14%. Inflation and unemployment were low. Home ownership was high. You'd be hard pressed to find any administration that presided over a better economic picture as it was in office. So the question is, how much of that booming 90s can Clinton take credit for, and how much was it just Clinton getting lucky to preside at a time of innovation and growth? Perhaps that new economy you mentioned earlier.
I think basically he was it was unsustainable. The boom was unsustainable because it was based on the stock market anyway. Then and even today as well was based on a speculation. And a kind of one of the phrases, asset-based Keynesianism. That is, the stock market's going up, other assets are going up, and okay, we can borrow against it and bank, whatever. And so, but that you did get the dot-com bust, you did get the bust of derivatives. It was unsustainable. Clinton was lucky. Greenspan kept interest rates lower, because of his theories about the new economy, and but the ideology that sustained it was misplaced. The idea that we have a new economy that's going to end, class conflict, going to end, the problems of inequality, going to end, this has simply not been borne out by history. And I think the Biden administration took some lessons from that and understood that.
Much has been made of the budget surplus the federal government enjoyed at the end of Clinton's term. We have not had one since. We haven't been close to one since. In hindsight, how much did that matter, that budget surplus? That so much of what he had done was in pursuit of it, as we talked at the top of this interview.
Right. There was a budget surplus. People were surprised about it, but there was, partly because there'd been a kind of austere budget earlier, and then you did increase taxes on the rich, and then the stock market booms. So there was 4 years of budget surplus. The liberals in the Clinton administration were still there. Said, "Let's spend it. Let's spend it on all sorts of whatever, infrastructure, welfare. Let's spend it." But the Republicans were in Congress. Greenspan was hostile to that, and Rubin really too. And so really they started talking about tax reduction. We could use this budget to cut taxes, which would mean really cutting them on the rich. And Al Gore in the year 2000 running for president, he talks about, let's put the budget surplus in a lockbox. What the heck does that mean? It means no ordinary voter or worker is going to get any benefit from this. It's going to, and so really Gore is handicapped when he runs for president. I mean, he won 500,000 more votes than Bush, but he should have won 5 million more votes. I mean, it was peace, prosperity, and a budget surplus. I mean, what more do you want? But he couldn't say we're going to have a program. And again, I think that people around, I mean, Biden and then frankly, his advisors, who were probably teenagers then, they sort of understood, this was a mistake. And so at least Biden, at least during the pandemic, didn't make that mistake. Now, it didn't pay off politically, but But
Yeah.
I think he took a lot of lessons from what Clinton should have done.
Speaking of lessons, what lessons in leadership can we learn from Clinton and how he managed these economic
Yeah,
challenges and
yeah.
opportunities of his time?
Well, one lesson for sure, which is maybe I didn't talk about as much as I would have in the book, is you should be a very effective party leader. You don't want to
Mhm.
divide your party. You don't want to do that. And Clinton did that. Clinton was just cavalier about that, and especially when it came to trade questions, he just lost the Democrats. He was by the end. So he was a terrible party leader, and you had that's one reason you had years of Republicans controlling Congress, and I think the second Bush administration. That's one thing for sure. The second is, and this is what Cheney Senior, what was his father's
Cheney? Or,
uh, Cheney, the Vice President Cheney,
yeah,
um,
Dick Cheney.
Dick Cheney. Yeah, Dick Cheney said this. He was right. Deficits don't matter. Deficits don't
Yeah,
matter. I mean, there are so many other things that bear on whether interest rates are going up or down, and that's the key reason. Deficits don't matter. He said that, and Clinton was fixated on that, or his advisors were, and that really hamstrung him, both in the early part of his administration and later on when he had a surplus. And so they don't. I mean, obviously at a certain point they would, but basically, interest rates aren't in lockstep with what the budget deficit is, and that both parties seem to have realized that today. So you can do big things. That's for sure. And then the third thing, of course, is that free trade. Free trade has it will have uh, yes, free trade does have benefits. You want to buy cheap toys for your kids or cheap T-shirts.
hmm
Everybody does. Oh yeah, it's cheaper. That's right, it is cheaper. But it has targeted uh, disabilities, targeted problems.
sure.
This factory town and that factory. And I think that the people who are hurt by free trade are much more sort of vocal and painful than the larger majority who is in some vague way has a T-shirt that's 50 cents cheaper than it would have been or something like that. And so I think we have become much more sensitive to that. Both parties have, and clearly Trump is doing that in his own very kind of crude and awkward way. But I think that is unquestionably the case. And again, China. I mean, if these countries remain authoritarian, I mean, the one reason that China could have a gigantic market for its own everything it wanted if it doubled wages, which could happen in China, and then they wouldn't have to export. They could have a huge market, but the authoritarian regime in China, it remains authoritarian. Is still export oriented for political
Mhm.
reasons, really, and that means that American industry is going to be undercut. So I think free trade is not free. That's for sure.
If you've enjoyed this interview with Nelson and want to learn more about Bill Clinton's economic legacy, please pick up A Fabulous Failure, The Clinton Presidency and the Transformation of American Capitalism from your favorite bookstore. Thank you for your time, Nelson.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends and family about the show, and leave a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/abridgedpresidentialhistories. This helps me buy books and pay to host the show, and thank you so much to everyone who has contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, have you ever signed up for one thing and gotten something entirely different instead? If you have, then you can relate to George W. Bush, who thought his presidency was going to be about taxes, education, and entitlement reform. But then, the largest terrorist attack in American history happened. What do you do? How do you respond? How do your priorities change? And what does that do to your legacy? It's George W. Bush, the decider, next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.